Imagine that for 2 millennia, billions of people have placed their faith in a set of texts, believing that every word contained therein was directly inspired by God. Now, what if I told you that the scriptures we read today might not be exactly the same as those originally written? This is not speculation or a conspiracy theory. It is the result of decades of research conducted by some of the greatest scholars of ancient languages and biblical manuscripts. The simple idea that a single mistranslated word can completely alter the meaning of a sentence is already impactful. Now, imagine what happens when multiple words and phrases over the centuries are interpreted in different ways, whether by error or by the influence of political or cultural interests. In this scenario, an entire doctrine can be transformed, and with it, the faith of millions of people around the world. In this video, we will uncover 3 of the biggest translation errors that have shaped our modern understanding of the Bible. We will examine how the word hell may have been completely misinterpreted, transforming a symbolic concept into an idea of eternal torment. We will also analyze one of the central doctrines of Christianity, which may have been built from an incorrect translation of an ancient Hebrew term. Finally, we will see how the very understanding of the nature of God may have been influenced by decisions made throughout history, often with political objectives in mind. But before we dive into these surprising revelations, it is essential to understand the translation process the Bible underwent over the centuries. Contrary to what many imagine, the Bible was not translated directly from an original text into modern languages. It was a long and complex process, traversing cultures, languages, and very distinct historical contexts. The Bible, as we know it, is a collection of texts written over more than 1,000 years by different authors in different times and places. The Old Testament was primarily written in Hebrew, with some parts in Aramaic, a common language in the ancient Mesopotamian region. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, the predominant commercial language in the Mediterranean world during the 1st century. Each of these ancient languages has nuances that are often impossible to translate precisely into other languages. This means that during the translation process, scholars face the challenge of preserving the original meaning of the words while making the text understandable to the audience of their respective times. In the 4th century, one of the most crucial moments in the history of Bible translation occurred when Saint Jerome was tasked with translating the sacred text into Latin. This version, known as the Vulgate, became the official text of the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. However, even Jerome recognized the immense difficulty of accurately translating the original texts, stating that a literal translation would make the text unintelligible, while changes in structure could distort the original meaning. Fast forward a few centuries, and we reach the period when the Bible began to be translated into English. Each of these translations reflected not only the linguistic knowledge of the time, but also the political and social conditions in which they were made. For example, the famous translation by William Tyndale, published in 1526, cost the translator his life, as he was executed for heresy. Later, in 1611, the King James Version emerged, which, in addition to being a religious translation, also carried a strong political component, reinforcing the authority of the British monarchy. These examples show how the Bible translation process was never purely technical or linguistic. There were always external influences, whether from religious leaders or rulers, who sought to shape the biblical message according to their own interests. Now that we understand this historical overview, we can begin to explore the 3 most significant examples of biblical passages that have been altered over time, resulting in profound changes in how we understand faith and Christian doctrine. The first example we will analyze is the word hell. This term, which today evokes images of a place of eternal torment filled with fire and suffering, was originally used to describe something quite different. In the original Hebrew text, the word used is Gehenna or Gehenna, which referred to a real location, the Valley of Hinnom, located south of ancient Jerusalem. The Valley of Hinnom had a dark history, being mentioned in the Old Testament as the place where child sacrifices to the Canaanite god Molech occurred. Later, during King Josiah's reign, these practices were banned, and the valley became used as a garbage dump, where waste was continuously burned. Thus, when Jesus mentioned the word Gehenna in his teachings, he was not referring to an abstract place of eternal torment, but rather to a tangible symbol of destruction and purification, something the Jews of the time could clearly see and understand. The problem began when the Bible was translated into Greek and subsequently into Latin. In the Greek version, the word Gehenna was retained, but when translated into Latin in the Vulgate, it became infernum, a term that in Roman culture was associated with the underworld, the realm of the dead. When this Latin version was translated into English, the term infernum gave rise to the word hell, which carried meanings similar to Helheim in Norse mythology, a dark and cold place where the dead remained. Over time, this new interpretation of Gehenna as a place of eternal torment was reinforced by literary and artistic works, the most notable being Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. From then on, the image of hell as a place of eternal punishment with demons, fire, and suffering became widely disseminated, definitively influencing Christian doctrine. This is just one of many examples of how a single translation can radically transform the original message of a biblical text. In the next example, we will see how the erroneous interpretation of a word in the Old Testament resulted in the creation of one of Christianity's most important doctrines, the virgin birth of Jesus. Our second example of controversial translation involves one of Christianity's most central doctrines, the virgin birth of Jesus. The belief that Jesus was born of a virgin is fundamental to many Christian traditions, but does this doctrine truly rest on the Bible's original text? To answer this question, we need to return to the Old Testament, specifically the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, we read, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." This passage is often cited as a prophecy of Jesus' birth, but there is an important detail that deserves analysis. In the original Hebrew text, the word used is not virgin, but rather Alma, which is better translated as young woman or maiden of marriageable age. If the original authors intended to refer specifically to a virgin, they would have used the word Betula, which clearly means a woman who has never had sexual relations. So how did this change occur? The answer lies in the translation of the Bible into Greek, known as the Septuagint, which was carried out around the 3rd century BC. The Greek translators, when converting the Hebrew term Alma, used the Greek word Parthenos, which can mean both virgin and young woman depending on the context. This translation choice was retained when the Bible was later translated into Latin, thus giving rise to the idea that Isaiah had prophesied the virgin birth of Jesus. This translation had a profound impact on the development of Christian doctrine. In the New Testament, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke mention the virgin birth of Jesus, and this belief became a cornerstone of Christian theology. Over time, the figure of Mary, the mother of Jesus, came to be venerated as the Virgin Mary, a symbol of purity and holiness. This doctrine influenced not only theology, but also Christian culture and morality over the centuries. However, modern scholars point out that Isaiah's prophecy, in its original context, had nothing to do with the birth of a Messiah, It referred to a specific event of the time during King Ahaz's reign, and the sign mentioned was a child to be born to a young woman known to the prophet, serving as a divine sign for the political context of that period. This leads us to an important reflection. Did this mistranslation change the way we understand the figure of Jesus and Mary's role in Christian history? By recognizing this discrepancy, we are not diminishing the Christian faith or the importance of Jesus' birth, but rather seeking to better understand how translations can evolve, and with them, doctrines and beliefs. This analysis helps us realize that the Bible is not a static text, but a living work, shaped by centuries of interpretations and reinterpretations. Our third and final example deals with one of the Bible's most iconic phrases: God created man in his own image and likeness. This declaration, found in the book of Genesis, has shaped humanity's understanding of itself and its relationship with the divine. However, the translation of this phrase over the centuries has also undergone subtle but significant changes that altered how it was interpreted. In the original Hebrew, the phrase is B'Tselem Elohim, which can be translated as "in the image of God." However, in the context of the ancient Near East, the expression "image of God" had a very specific meaning. In many cultures of that region, only kings were considered to be in the image of the gods. This justified their absolute authority and divine right to rule. Therefore, when the Genesis text declares that all humanity was created in the image of God, it is making a revolutionary statement. All human beings, not just kings or leaders, carry the divine image. This idea subverted the prevailing notion of the time that only a privileged elite could represent the divine on earth. However, as this phrase was translated into Greek, Latin, and later into modern languages, its original meaning began to be lost. In medieval Europe, for example, this passage was often interpreted in a way that reinforced existing social hierarchies. The church and the nobility used the idea of being in the image of God to justify their positions of power, claiming that they reflected the divine will more clearly than the rest of the population. This erroneous interpretation had profound consequences. It was used to sustain the divine right of kings, a doctrine that stated that monarchs' authority came directly from God, not from the people. It also strengthened the church's power, positioning it as the only institution capable of correctly interpreting divine will. This perpetuated social and political inequalities for centuries until movements like the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment began to challenge these power structures. By rediscovering the original meaning of B'Tselem Elohim, we can understand that this phrase is not a tool to justify the authority of an elite, but rather a declaration of equality and dignity for all humanity. All human beings, regardless of their social position, gender, or ethnicity, carry the divine image and therefore deserve to be treated with respect and justice. These three examples, the word hell, the prophecy about the Virgin, and the phrase "in the image of God," illustrate how translations and interpretations throughout history can profoundly alter the meaning of biblical texts. They also show us the importance of revisiting these passages in light of their original context, seeking to understand what the authors truly intended to communicate. With advances in technology and academic studies, we now have access to an unprecedented amount of information about ancient texts. This allows us not only to read the Bible, but also to study its historical and linguistic context, deepening our understanding of its messages. However, this journey requires courage. The courage to ask difficult questions, the courage to admit that what we believed may not be exactly what was written, and the courage to seek the truth, even when it challenges our deepest beliefs. When we are willing to face these questions, we discover that faith does not weaken, but strengthens. Understanding the true message of the sacred texts allows us to experience a more authentic faith, rooted in the pursuit of truth and understanding. Throughout history, the translation of the Bible has not been just a matter of language. It has also been a matter of power, control, and, in many cases, political and religious agendas. This becomes clear when we analyze how certain words and concepts were interpreted in ways that benefited those in power. The example of the word hell, as we saw earlier, is an emblematic case. But the manipulation of translations is not limited to this term. Many other passages have been deliberately shaped to reinforce specific doctrines and control the way millions of people viewed God and faith. Let us now delve deeper into another critical aspect: the impact of erroneous translations on social structures and religious institutions. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church wielded immense power over people's lives, and one of the main tools to maintain this control was the Bible itself. However, since most of the population could neither read nor understand Latin, they relied on the interpretations provided by the clergy. This created a situation where the Church held the monopoly on interpreting sacred texts. It was in this context that translations emerged that reinforced the authority of the Church and the monarchs, such as the famous King James Version, published in 1611. This translation was commissioned by King James I of England, and although it is widely respected to this day, many scholars point out that it also had a political objective: to consolidate the monarch's power and reinforce the idea of the divine right of kings. But translations were not just a tool for political control, they also shaped the morals and ethics of societies. A clear example of this is how the image of Mary, the mother of Jesus, was exalted over the centuries. As we mentioned earlier, the incorrect translation of Alma as virgin created a doctrine that elevated Mary to a status of unattainable purity. This image of Mary profoundly influenced how women were viewed and treated in Christian societies, creating unrealistic expectations about female purity and morality. For centuries, women were placed on a pedestal of sanctity, but were simultaneously deprived of basic rights and an active voice in society. The exaltation of Mary's virginity contributed to the idea that sexual purity was a woman's main attribute of value, reinforcing a patriarchal culture that persisted for many centuries. This is a clear example of how an erroneous translation can have implications that go far beyond the theological field, affecting the real lives of millions of people. Another point worth highlighting is how the translation of the Bible influenced the view of salvation and sin. In the original Hebrew text, the word often translated as sin is closer in meaning to missing the mark or deviating from the path. It is a word that carries the idea that sin is a human failure, something that can be corrected through repentance and a change of attitude. However, throughout translations, this idea was replaced by a more rigid and punitive view. Sin came to be seen as something irrevocable that condemns humans to an eternal fate of torment. This shift in perspective had a profound impact on how people view themselves and their shortcomings. Instead of seeing sin as an opportunity for learning and growth, it came to be seen as an inevitable condemnation. This punitive view of sin was widely exploited by the Church during the Middle Ages, when the fear of hell and eternal condemnation was used as a form of control. The sale of indulgences, for example, was based on the idea that people could avoid eternal punishment by paying the Church to obtain forgiveness for their sins. This system generated immense wealth for the Church, but also led to indignation and protests, culminating in the Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther in the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation brought a new perspective on the Bible and its interpretation. Luther advocated that each individual should have direct access to the sacred texts and interpret them for themselves without the need for an intermediary. This led to the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages and the dissemination of versions more accessible to the general public. However, even after the Reformation, translations continued to be influenced by cultural and political issues. An interesting example is how the word love was translated in different passages. In the original Greek of the New Testament, there are several words to describe different types of love, such as agape, unconditional love, philia, brotherly love, and eros, erotic love. However, in many translations, all these words were simply translated as love, thus losing the richness and nuance of the original text. This simplification impacted how we understand Jesus' teachings on love. When Jesus said, "Love one another as I have loved you," he used the word agape, referring to an unconditional and altruistic love. However, by translating it simply as love, we lose this nuance and fail to fully grasp the type of love he preached. Another example is the word faith. In the original Greek, the word used is pistis, which has a broader meaning than simply believing in something. It implies trust, loyalty, and fidelity. However, in many translations, pistis has been reduced to faith, suggesting that faith is only an intellectual belief when in reality it involves a deep trust relationship with God. These examples show that throughout history, the translation of the Bible was not just about making the text understandable, but also about shaping how people understand fundamental concepts of faith. When we lose these nuances, we also lose part of the richness and depth of biblical teachings. Therefore, it is essential that when we read the Bible, we keep in mind that we are dealing with translations that have undergone centuries of interpretations and reinterpretations. Seeking to understand the historical, cultural, and linguistic context in which these texts were written allows us to have a deeper and more authentic understanding of the biblical message. Today, with advances in technology and academic studies, we have access to ancient manuscripts and tools that allow us to study the Bible in more detail than ever before. This gives us the opportunity to revisit these translations and uncover meanings that have long remained hidden. But this journey requires courage. Courage to question what we have always been taught. Courage to recognize that the truth may be more complex than we imagined. And above all, courage to seek that truth, even if it challenges our deepest beliefs. By doing so, we are not weakening our faith, but strengthening it. We are seeking a more authentic and profound understanding of God and His message. And this pursuit, although challenging, is worthwhile because the truth, even when uncomfortable, always sets us free. As we have seen throughout this script, Bible translations have played a fundamental role in how humanity has understood God, faith, and itself over the centuries. From the original meaning of Gina, which was transformed into the modern conception of hell, to the misinterpretation of Alma as virgin, and the distortion of the phrase "in the image of God," each of these changes has left deep marks on doctrines, cultures, and religious institutions. It is essential to understand that the Bible, although a sacred text for billions of people, was written in a historical context very different from ours. By ignoring this context and relying solely on modern translations, we risk misinterpreting the original message. Fortunately, with the resources available today, we can get closer and closer to the true meaning of these texts, seeking to understand the author's intentions and the environment in which they lived. This leads us to an important reflection. We should not fear the search for truth. Questioning translations, re-examining doctrines, and trying to understand what was truly said do not diminish our faith. On the contrary, they strengthen it. After all, authentic faith is not based on blind beliefs but on a deep and honest understanding of the truth. Therefore, the most valuable lesson we can take from this study is the importance of being open to learning and constant re-evaluation. The Bible is not just a book to be read. It is a work to be studied, questioned, and lived. When we commit to understanding its original messages, we discover a wealth of meanings that can transform not only our faith, but also our way of living. Now, I want to invite you to share these discoveries. If you know someone who could benefit from this information, send this video to them. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new content that uncovers the hidden truths of biblical history. And if this content helped you see the Bible in a new way, leave your like and a comment sharing your reflections. Together, we can build a community of truth seekers committed to faith and knowledge. Thank you very much for watching until here, and see you next time.